The morning sun cast a golden glow over the neighborhood as Walter Jenkins stepped out onto his front porch. At 72 years old, his movements were slower than they once were, but his eyes still sparkled with the same wisdom and kindness that had guided thousands of students during his time as a high school principal. Walter breathed in the fresh spring air and smiled. Sunday mornings were sacred to him. This was his time to tend to his garden, a hobby he picked up after retiring 10 years ago. The neighbors often stopped to admire his roses, which had won first prize at the county fair 3 years running. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins," called Mrs. Thompson from across the street as she collected her newspaper. Walter waved back with a smile. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" He had lived in this house for 42 years. He and his late wife, Carol, had raised their 3 children here. Now the children were grown with families of their own, but they visited often. The walls of Walter's living room were covered with family photos, graduations, weddings, and new grandchildren. Walter put on his gardening gloves and knelt carefully beside his prized rose bushes. His knees weren't what they used to be, but gardening kept him active. He hummed softly as he worked, an old jazz tune that Carol used to love. He didn't notice the police cruiser until it had already pulled up at the curb. 2 officers stepped out, looking around the neighborhood with suspicious eyes before walking up his driveway. "Excuse me, sir," said the taller officer, a man who looked to be in his early 30s. His nameplate read Officer Brooks. "We received a call about someone suspicious in the area." Walter stood up slowly, brushing soil from his pants. "Good morning, officers. I'm just working in my garden." The second officer, Officer Rayleigh, crossed his arms. "You live here?" His tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Yes, for over 40 years now," Walter replied calmly. He'd dealt with situations like this before. "I'm Walter Jenkins. This is my home." Officer Brooks narrowed his eyes. "We've had reports of break-ins in this neighborhood. Do you have any identification on you?" Walter gestured to his gardening clothes, an old t-shirt and worn jeans. "I'm just out here gardening. My wallet's inside the house." "Convenient," muttered Officer Rayleigh. "And what exactly are you doing out here so early?" Walter glanced at his watch. "It was 10:30 a.m. gardening, as I said. These roses need daily attention." By now, a few neighbors had noticed the police car and were watching curiously from their yards. Walter saw his neighbor Tom look over with concern. "I'll need to see some ID," Officer Brooks insisted, his hand resting casually on his belt near his holster. "Otherwise, we'll have to take you down to the station to verify your identity." Walter felt his heart rate increase but kept his voice steady. "Officers, I'm Walter Jenkins. I've lived here since 1983. I was the principal at Roosevelt High School for 30 years. Many people in this community know me." Officer Rayleigh stepped closer. "Look, buddy, we don't care if you say you're the mayor. No ID, big problem." Walter noticed Mrs. Thompson watching worriedly from across the street. She took a few steps toward them, but he subtly shook his head. No need to put her in an uncomfortable position. "I'll get my wallet," Walter said. "It's just inside the door." "Hold on," Officer Brooks said sharply. "We'll escort you. Can't have you running off or grabbing something else." Walter felt a flash of indignation but kept his face neutral. As a black man who had lived through the civil rights era, he had learned long ago how to handle situations like this. Keep calm, don't escalate, live to fight another day. "Of course, officers," he said quietly. "Follow me." As they walked toward his front door, Walter noticed more neighbors gathering. The beautiful morning was now tainted, the peace of his garden ritual shattered. But Walter knew something these officers didn't. He wasn't just any 72-year-old man they could intimidate. And soon, they would regret their actions on this sunny Sunday morning. Walter's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his front door, not from fear, but from a simmering anger he had learned to control decades ago. He had faced this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. "I keep my wallet on the table just inside," Walter explained calmly. Officer Brooks followed too closely behind him, as if expecting Walter to make a run for it. The thought was almost laughable. Where would a 72-year-old man with arthritis in both knees run to? Inside, Walter's home was neat and comfortable. Family photos lined the hallway, his daughter's law school graduation, his son in military uniform, grandchildren blowing out birthday candles. Officer Brooks barely glanced at them. Walter picked up his wallet from the small table by the door and opened it, pulling out his driver's license. "Here you are, officers. As I said, I'm Walter Jenkins. This is my home." Officer Rayleigh snatched the license and studied it with narrowed eyes, as if expecting it to be fake. "This address matches," he finally admitted, sounding almost disappointed. "Of course it does," Walter said. "Now, may I please return to my gardening? Those roses won't prune themselves." Officer Brooks didn't move. "Sir, we still need to investigate the suspicious activity report. What exactly were you doing outside that might have concerned someone?" Walter took a deep breath. "I was gardening, in my own front yard, in broad daylight, wearing gardening gloves and using gardening tools." "No need for the attitude," Officer Rayleigh snapped. "Turn around and put your hands on the wall." Walter stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me. You heard me. Hands on the wall. On what grounds?" Walter asked, his voice steady despite his rising pulse. "You've confirmed my identity and that I live here. What possible reason could you have to search me?" By now, more neighbors had gathered outside. Walter could see Tom from next door, standing on the sidewalk, phone in hand. Mrs. Thompson was there too, along with several others. "You're being uncooperative," Officer Brooks said, reaching for Walter's arm. "That's suspicious behavior." Walter pulled his arm away instinctively. "Do not touch me. I have done nothing wrong." That was all the excuse they needed. Both officers moved in at once. Officer Brooks twisted Walter's arm behind his back, while Officer Rayleigh shoved him against the wall. The pain shot through Walter's shoulder like fire. "Stop resisting," Officer Rayleigh shouted, though Walter had gone completely still. "I am not resisting," Walter said through gritted teeth. The officer's hands were rough as they patted him down, checking his pockets. The indignity of it burned worse than the physical pain. They marched him outside and pushed him against the garage door. The cool metal pressed against Walter's cheek as Officer Brooks pulled out his handcuffs. "This is unnecessary," Walter said, loud enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. "I am a 72-year-old man standing in my own driveway." The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Walter's wrists. Tears of humiliation threatened to form in his eyes, but he blinked them away. He wouldn't give these officers the satisfaction. "Walter, are you okay?" called Tom from the sidewalk. His phone was raised, recording the scene. "I'm fine, Tom," Walter replied. "Just a misunderstanding that's gone too far." Officer Rayleigh turned to the small crowd. "Everyone needs to disperse. This is police business." "It's harassment is what it is," said Mrs. Thompson boldly. "He's lived here longer than most of us." Walter could see more phones recording now. Part of him felt ashamed to be seen like this, handcuffed like a criminal, but another part was glad for the witnesses. "I'd like to make a phone call," Walter said calmly. Officer Brooks laughed. "This isn't a TV show, old man. You're not under arrest, yet. You don't get a phone call." "Actually," Walter said, "I believe I do. I'd like to contact someone who can verify my identity and clear this up quickly." "And who would that be?" "Your grandson," Officer Rayleigh mocked. Walter looked him straight in the eye. "Someone who can resolve this situation before it gets worse for everyone involved, especially you two." The confidence in Walter's voice made Officer Brooks pause. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "One phone call," Walter repeated. "That's all I ask." Little did they know that one phone call would change everything. 20 minutes passed with Walter standing handcuffed in his own driveway. The spring sun beat down on his head, and his knees ached from standing so long. Several neighbors had refused to leave despite the officer's orders. Tom was still filming, and Mrs. Thompson had brought Walter a glass of water, which Officer Rayleigh had reluctantly allowed him to sip. "Look," Walter said finally. "This situation has gone on long enough. I've shown you my ID. My neighbors have confirmed who I am. Either arrest me and explain to your superiors why you arrested a senior citizen for gardening, or let me make that phone call." Officer Brooks and Officer Rayleigh exchanged glances. They seemed to be realizing they had backed themselves into a corner. They couldn't arrest Walter without cause, but letting him go now would be admitting they were wrong. "Fine," Officer Brooks said at last. "You can make your call, but put it on speaker." Walter nodded. "I have nothing to hide." Officer Rayleigh removed Walter's right hand from the cuffs but kept his left hand secured. Walter rubbed his sore wrist, then reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, showing a background photo of his grandchildren. "Who are you calling?" Officer Brooks demanded. "Your lawyer?" Walter smiled slightly. "No, someone who can clear this up much faster." The officers watched closely as Walter scrolled through his contacts and pressed a name. He put the phone on speaker as requested and held it up. The phone rang 3 times before a deep voice answered. "Walter, good to hear from you. How are those roses doing this season?" Officer Brooks frowned, clearly not expecting such a friendly greeting. "They were doing fine until this morning, Ray," Walter replied calmly. "I'm afraid I have a situation here I could use your help with." "What's going on?" The voice on the phone shifted immediately to concern. "I'm currently standing in my driveway in handcuffs," Walter said. "2 of your officers seemed to think I was suspicious while gardening in my own yard." There was a brief silence on the line. "You're kidding me," the voice said finally. "Who are the officers?" Before Walter could answer, Officer Brooks cut in. "Sir, this is Officer Brooks. Who am I speaking with?" "This is Chief Raymond Wilson," came the reply, the tone now ice-cold. "And you'd better have a damn good explanation for why Walter Jenkins is in handcuffs." The blood drained from Officer Brooks' face. Officer Rayleigh's mouth fell open. The neighbors watching from the sidewalk murmured in surprise. "Chief Wilson, we were responding to a call about suspicious activity in the area," Officer Rayleigh stammered. "Standard procedure." "Walter Jenkins served on the Civilian Police Oversight Committee for 12 years, Chief Wilson interrupted. "He helped write half the procedures you're supposed to be following. And you're telling me you handcuffed him for gardening?" Walter watched the officers' expressions with quiet satisfaction. What they didn't know, what most people didn't know, was that Chief Wilson had been one of Walter's students 30 years ago. A troubled kid from a rough neighborhood whom Walter had taken under his wing, helped get into college, and mentored throughout his career. "Ray," Walter said gently, "I'd appreciate it if someone could come sort this out. My neighbors are upset, and my roses are still only half pruned." "I'm sending Lieutenant Garcia right now," Chief Wilson replied. "And I'm on my way personally. Should be there in 15 minutes. Officers Brooks and Rayleigh, you are to remove those handcuffs immediately and wait for my arrival." "Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," both officers mumbled, avoiding Walter's eyes. "Walter, are you hurt?" Chief Wilson asked, his voice softening. "Nothing serious, Ray. Just my pride, perhaps. Stay on the line with me until Garcia gets there." As Officer Brooks fumbled with the handcuff key, Walter noticed the shift in the air. The neighbors were whispering among themselves. Mrs. Thompson was smiling. Tom gave him a thumbs up from behind his phone. In just one phone call, everything had changed. Walter flexed his freed wrists and thought about how sometimes life prepares you for moments you never expect to face. The atmosphere in Walter's front yard had completely changed. Officer Brooks and Officer Rayleigh stood awkwardly by their patrol car, speaking in hushed tones and throwing nervous glances toward Walter. The handcuffs were off, but the damage was done. Walter's wrists were marked with red lines, and his shoulder still ached from being roughly handled. Walter sat on his porch steps, sipping water that Mrs. Thompson had brought him. Several neighbors remained on the sidewalk, unwilling to leave him alone with the officers who had mistreated him. "You doing okay, Walter?" Tom called from across the yard. Walter gave him a tired smile and a thumbs up. "I'm fine, Tom. Thank you for staying." Inside, Walter was a mix of emotions. Anger at being humiliated in his own neighborhood. Relief that Chief Wilson had responded so quickly. And a deep, familiar sadness that even at 72, after a lifetime of service to his community, this could still happen to him because of the color of his skin. The sound of a car engine broke through his thoughts. A police SUV with Lieutenant Bars pulled up behind the patrol car. A woman in uniform stepped out, Lieutenant Garcia. Walter recognized her from community meetings. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, approaching with respect in her voice. "I'm so sorry about this situation." Before Walter could respond, another vehicle pulled up, an unmarked police car that parked half on the curb in haste. Chief Raymond Wilson stepped out, not bothering to close his door as he strode toward Walter. At 45, Chief Wilson was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair graying at the temples. His uniform was impeccable, badges gleaming in the sunlight. But what struck onlookers most was the genuine concern on his face as he approached Walter. "Walter," he said, his official demeanor dropping away as he reached out to clasp the older man's hand. "Are you all right?" Walter stood, wincing slightly at the stiffness in his joints. "I'm okay, Ray. Nothing that won't heal." Chief Wilson looked at Walter's wrists, noting the marks from the handcuffs. His jaw tightened visibly. "Lieutenant," he called without looking away, "get the body cam footage from both officers. I want it secured immediately." "Yes, sir," Garcia replied, moving toward Brooks and Rayleigh. Chief Wilson turned to face the two officers, who now stood at attention. "You two. Report to my office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. You're both on administrative leave starting right now." Civ Officer Brooks began. "Not another word," Chief Wilson cut him off. "Lieutenant Garcia will take your statement here, and then you're dismissed. Hand over your badges and guns to her before you leave." The neighbors watched in silent satisfaction as the two officers who had been so arrogant minutes ago now looked like scolded schoolboys. Chief Wilson turned back to Walter, his voice softening. "Let's get you inside. I want to make sure you're really okay." As they walked toward Walter's front door, Mrs. Thompson stepped forward. "Chief Wilson, we all saw what happened. We had videos." The chief nodded gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am. Lieutenant Garcia will take your contact information. Those videos could be important evidence." Inside Walter's living room, Chief Wilson's professional mask dropped completely. "I can't believe this happened to you of all people," he said, helping Walter into his favorite armchair. "You're the reason I became an officer in the first place." Walter smiled sadly. "That's why I called you, Ray. Not just to help me, but because I knew you'd handle it right." Chief Wilson shook his head. "You remember when I was 17, getting into trouble every other week? You were the only one who saw something in me worth saving." "I didn't save you, Ray. I just showed you who you already were." The chief looked around the familiar living room, at the photos of Walter with generations of students. "Half the department has a story about you, you know. How you mentored them, or helped their kids, or served on the oversight committee making sure we did right by the community." He knelt down beside Walter's chair. "I promise you, this won't be swept under the rug. Those officers will face consequences, and we'll use this to make real changes in training." Walter nodded, patting the younger man's shoulder. "That's all I've ever wanted, Ray, for the system to work the way it should." Through the window, they could see Lieutenant Garcia collecting statements from the neighbors. The community had come together, rallying around one of their own. "You should put some ice on those wrists," Chief Wilson said. "And I want you to get checked out at the hospital, just to be safe." Walter looked down at his hands. Hands that had guided countless young people, tended beautiful gardens, and now, perhaps, would help bring about another kind of change. The next morning, Walter's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Friends, former students, and neighbors all called to check on him after hearing what had happened. The local newspaper had already picked up the story, and a reporter was eager to interview him. Walter sat at his kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside him. His wrists were still sore, and he'd slept poorly. Chief Wilson had insisted he visit the emergency room yesterday, where they documented his injuries, minor bruising, but enough to prove excessive force had been used. "No, I don't want to press charges," Walter told his nephew Paul, who was a lawyer in the city. "I want something better than punishment. I want change." The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock. Walter opened it to find Chief Wilson in a suit rather than his uniform, looking solemn. "You're right on time," Walter said, letting him in. "Some lessons stick with you," Chief Wilson replied with a faint smile. "You always said being late shows disrespect for other people's time." They settled in Walter's living room. Chief Wilson had brought documents, incident reports, preliminary findings, and recommendations. "The bodycam footage is damning," he said, placing a folder on the coffee table. "Officer Brooks turned his camera on late, against protocol, but we still have enough. And the neighbors' videos fill in the gaps." Walter nodded. "And the officers?" "Officer Rayleigh admits they had no reasonable cause to detain you. Officer Brooks is still claiming they were following procedure for a suspicious person call." Chief Wilson's expression hardened. But the facts don't support that. There was no caller. Dispatch has no record of any call about suspicious activity in this neighborhood yesterday morning. Walter sat back, absorbing this. So they just saw an old black man in an affluent neighborhood and decided I didn't belong here. That's what it looks like, Chief Wilson admitted. I've started the process for terminating Officer Brooks. His record shows 2 previous complaints about racial profiling. Officer Rayleigh is being suspended without pay, pending completion of retraining and community service. Walter thought about this for a moment. You know, Ray, firing one officer won't fix the underlying problem. I know, Chief Wilson agreed. That's why I wanted to ask for your help. Outside, cars were pulling up. Walter checked his watch. Right on time, he said. Chief Wilson looked confused. You expecting someone? Several someones, actually, Walter replied. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of inviting some people to join our discussion. Walter opened his front door to welcome a group that made Chief Wilson stand up in surprise. There was Judge Henderson, who oversaw the city's court system, Dr. Hayes, president of the local community college, Councilwoman Patterson from the city government, and several community leaders from different neighborhoods. What's this? Chief Wilson asked. Walter smiled. These are people who can help us turn an ugly incident into meaningful progress. Everyone here has influence in their own sphere. Together, we might actually get something done. For the next 2 hours, Walter's living room became an impromptu community forum. Chief Wilson presented the facts of the case openly, hiding nothing. The others listened, asked questions, and offered perspectives from their own experiences. We need better training, said Dr. Hayes. The community college can help develop a curriculum on implicit bias and cultural awareness. And we need accountability that doesn't just happen when the victim knows the police chief, added Councilwoman Patterson. I can propose funding for an expanded civilian oversight board. Judge Henderson nodded. The courts can work with the prosecutor's office to ensure officers who violate civil rights face appropriate consequences. Walter watched with quiet satisfaction. This was what he had hoped for, not just punishment for 2 officers, but a pathway to systemic change. By afternoon, they had drafted an action plan with specific commitments from each person present. Chief Wilson would implement new training protocols. The councilwoman would secure funding. The judge would review police misconduct cases personally. As the meeting broke up, Chief Wilson pulled Walter aside. You turned what happened to you into something positive, he said. Most people would just be angry. Walter smiled tiredly. Oh, I'm plenty angry, Ray. But I learned long ago that anger without action is just noise. And I've never been one to make noise when I could make change instead. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after the incident, Walter couldn't keep up with his ringing phone. Local TV stations wanted interviews. Community groups invited him to speak. Even the mayor had called, apologizing and promising a full review of police practices. Walter's quiet life had been turned upside down. He sat in his garden, trying to finish the rose pruning that had been interrupted Sunday morning. His grandson Anthony had come to stay with him for a few days, worried about all the attention. Grandpa, Channel 5 is at the door again, Anthony said, coming out to the garden. Want me to tell them you're busy? Walter sighed, putting down his gardening shears. No, it's all right. Shove them back here. Might as well talk while I work. The young reporter looked nervous as she approached Walter among his roses. Mr. Jenkins, thank you for speaking with us. Your story has really touched the community. Walter nodded. It's not just my story. That's what people need to understand. The interview lasted 15 minutes. Walter spoke calmly about what had happened, but focused more on what needed to change. He didn't call for the officers to be fired or vilify the entire police department. Instead, he talked about better training, community oversight, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. Those officers saw an old black man in a nice neighborhood and made assumptions, Walter told the reporter. That's not good policing. Good policing is about protecting and serving everyone, not just some people. As the TV crew packed up, Walter noticed a group gathering at the end of his driveway. He recognized Mrs. Thompson and Tom, but there were at least 30 others, many holding signs. We stand with Walter, one read. Respect our elders, said another. Tom approached with a shy smile. Hope you don't mind, Walter. We wanted to show support. Walter was touched. Not at all. By evening, the impromptu gathering had grown. Someone brought folding chairs. Another neighbor set up a table with lemonade and cookies. People Walter had known for decades mingled with folks from across town who had heard his story on the news. Walter's daughter Lisa arrived from out of town, hugging her father tightly. "Dad, I can't believe this happened to you," she said, tears in her eyes. "I'm okay, sweetie," Walter assured her. "And look what's come from it." He gestured to the gathering, which now filled his front yard and spilled onto the sidewalk. There were people of all ages and backgrounds. Children played on the grass while their parents talked. Teenagers handed out water bottles. Elderly neighbors shared stories of their own experiences with prejudice over the decades. Chief Wilson arrived in civilian clothes, looking uncertain at the edge of the crowd until Walter waved him over. "Brave of you to come," Walter said. The chief shrugged. "You taught me to face problems head-on." Together they addressed the gathering. Chief Wilson announced new police training requirements and the formation of a community advisory board that Walter had agreed to co-chair. There was applause, but Walter could tell people wanted more than just promises. "May I speak?" asked an older woman Walter didn't recognize. She introduced herself as Mrs. Clark from the east side of town. 20 years ago, my son was handcuffed in our own backyard by police who said he matched the description of a burglar. He was just 16, taking out the trash. No one believed us when we complained." Her voice broke. What happened to Mr. Jenkins brought it all back. But seeing the chief here, admitting what went wrong and promising change, that's something I never thought I'd see. One by one, people shared similar stories. Some were recent, others decades old. Each speaker thanked Walter for standing up and using his connections to force accountability. Walter listened, his heart heavy with the weight of so many experiences like his own. When everyone had spoken, he stood with the help of his cane. "I didn't want any of this attention," he said simply. "I just wanted to tend my roses in peace. But sometimes life puts you in a position to make a difference." He looked around at the faces watching him. What happened Sunday morning was wrong, but what's happening right now is right. We're talking to each other. We're listening. And we're demanding better from those who are sworn to protect us all. As evening fell, someone started singing an old civil rights anthem. Others joined in, voices rising in the twilight. Walter felt Lisa's hand slip into his. On his other side, Anthony stood tall and proud. The gathering eventually became a weekly event, Sunday afternoons in Walter's garden, which people started calling Community Circle. It wasn't all about police reform. Neighbors helped each other with problems. Young people got advice from elders. Children played together while parents who might never have met became friends. What had begun with humiliation and anger had somehow blossomed into something beautiful, right alongside Walter's prize-winning roses. 1 year had passed since that Sunday morning when Walter Jenkins was handcuffed in his own driveway. The calendar had come full circle, and spring had returned to the neighborhood. Walter's roses were blooming again, more beautiful than ever. Walter adjusted his tie as he looked in the mirror. At 73, he found himself busier than he'd been in years. The community meetings in his garden had grown into something bigger, a citywide initiative called the Neighborhood Bridge Program, bringing residents and police officers together in regular, informal gatherings. "Dad, we should get going," Lisa called from the living room. "They can't start without you, but we shouldn't keep everyone waiting." Walter smiled. His daughter had moved back to town permanently, taking a teaching position at the local high school. She said it was to be closer to him as he aged, but Walter suspected she'd been inspired by the changes happening in their community. "Coming?" Walter replied, giving his reflection one final check. The police academy graduation ceremony was being held at the community college auditorium. When Walter and Lisa arrived, the place was packed. Chief Wilson met them at the entrance, looking sharp in his dress uniform. "There he is," the chief said warmly, shaking Walter's hand. "Our guest of honor." Walter shook his head. "I'm just here to say a few words, Ray. These new officers are the real stars today." Inside, Walter was shown to a seat on the stage. From there, he could see familiar faces throughout the crowd. Mrs. Thompson waving enthusiastically, Tom with his wife, Judge Henderson, and dozens of others who had become regular attendees at the community circle meetings. The The ceremony began with the traditional procession of cadets. 30 young men and women in crisp new uniforms filed in, faces solemn with the weight of the responsibility they were about to assume. Chief Wilson gave the opening remarks, speaking about the department's new direction. Today marks the first graduating class to complete our expanded training program, he announced proudly. In addition to standard police academy requirements, these officers have completed 80 hours of community engagement training, implicit bias education, and de-escalation techniques. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. Walter felt a swell of pride. Those additional training hours had been his suggestion, drafted during one of the earliest meetings in his living room and approved by the city council 6 months ago. When it was Walter's turn to speak, he rose slowly, his knees protesting as they always did these days. The auditorium fell silent. 1 year ago, Walter began, I was gardening in my yard when 2 officers decided I didn't belong in my own neighborhood. He paused, looking out at the attentive faces. That morning could have just been another sad story. Another example of prejudice and power misused. But instead, it became the beginning of something important. Walter spoke simply about his experiences, about the community that had rallied around him, and about the changes that had followed. He didn't use big words or complicated ideas. He just told the truth as he had lived it. Officer Brooks was fired, Walter acknowledged, and that was necessary. But more important is what happened with Officer Rayleigh. He gestured toward the side of the stage where Officer Rayleigh stood in uniform, looking nervous but determined. Officer Rayleigh could have fought his suspension. He could have made excuses. Instead, he did the hard work of examining his actions and the assumptions behind them. He completed every hour of his retraining and community service. He came to our Sunday meetings and listened, really listened, to people's experiences. Officer Rayleigh stepped forward at Walter's invitation. This officer made a terrible mistake with me, Walter said, but he's worked hard to learn from it. Now he helps train others, sharing his story as a warning about what happens when bias affects judgment. That's the kind of accountability that creates real change. The applause was tentative at first, then grew stronger. Officer Rayleigh's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he shook Walter's hand and returned to his position. Walter turned to address the graduates directly. The badge you'll receive today comes with power. How you use that power matters. Will you use it to protect some people or all people? Will you assume the worst when you see someone who looks different from you? Or will you remember that every person deserves respect and fair treatment? After the ceremony, people lingered in the auditorium. Several of the new officers asked to take photos with Walter. One young woman, the valedictorian of the class, told him she decided to become an officer after attending a community circle meeting in his garden. My grandmother lives on the east side, she explained. She never trusted police. But seeing how things are changing, hearing you speak about building bridges, it made me think maybe I could be part of the solution. As Walter walked slowly to the car with Lisa, he spotted a familiar figure waiting near the exit, the new Mayor Johnson, who had won on a platform of community-centered policing. Mr. Jenkins, the mayor said, hurrying over. I wanted to thank you personally. The Jenkins Police Training Initiative is being noticed by other cities. We've had inquiries from 3 state capitals about implementing similar programs. Walter nodded, pleased but not surprised. Good ideas tended to spread when they worked. That evening, back home among his roses, Walter reflected on how a single phone call had set so much in motion. One connection, used at the right moment, had created ripples that continued to spread outward, touching more lives than he could count. He carefully cut one perfect rose and placed it in a vase on his bedside table, a reminder that beauty could grow even after the harshest pruning.